This is the CCW Happy Hour Podcast series. I'm Brian Cantor, Principal Analyst for CCW, and your host for today's discussion. No matter where you are in the world, and no matter what reopening looks like for you at this particular moment, I think you can agree on two things. One, we as customer contact professionals have come a long way from where we were back at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've made significant progress in terms of adapting to a new work environment, leveraging new technology, and dealing with massive changes in customer behavior, sentiment, and expectations. But we can also all agree that it's not over yet. Even if you're in a place where offices are starting to reopen and infection numbers are going down, the challenges are certainly not subsiding. Things are still unpredictable, they're uncertain, and frankly, in many cases, they're chaotic. We're still trying to adapt to our urgent needs. And even if you are successfully addressing your needs right now, you surely recognize the need for some long-term change. The need to take what we've learned, how we've adapted, and make that a permanent future for our contact centers. And that can include things like making work from home more permanent, keeping our renewed emphasis on quality and digital channels and new agent responsibilities. Insert your shift here, odds are it's going to stick and going to play a role in the future of your contact center. And so as we work to become more customer-centric, we actually need to think about the intersection of these two concepts. On the one hand, we have all these short-term, unpredictable things to conquer, to keep focusing on. But on the other hand, we want to start looking forward and building long-term business continuity. So how do we do it? How do we decide what to prioritize in the short term, and then what long-term changes we can at least start preparing for? That question, that line of thinking, is the focus of today's discussion. Now, this discussion is going to take place in two parts. Part one will be today's podcast, and then we're going to give you a full breakdown of the entire discussion in CCW Online, our summit this July, which has the theme Modernizing Service Experiences with AI and Digital. Today's chat is largely going to focus on the people component, the continuity stuff, the things about building a long-term strategy and how the overall contact center is changing. And then we'll dive into AI and digital as part of the event. And for today's discussion, we're thrilled to have one of our longtime advisory board members, a customer contact leader at Dun Bradstreet, someone who really focuses on the ins and outs of customer contact, both within his own organization as well as the industry at large. So Brad Nichols, thrilled to have you joining us today.
Hey, Brian. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here.
Definitely. So before we get started, anything you want to share as far as your background, what you've been working on, why you see this topic is so relevant today?
Yeah, so those who may not know me, I've spent over the last 20 years working in customer service and contact centers in one way, shape, or form. I've been at Dun Bradstreet now for about 4 years, running their global customer service operation. And before that, I also spent the better part of 12 or 13 years at Reuters and Thomson Reuters, also in the financial services sector, doing a lot of customer service and customer engagement.
Great. So with that background, clearly the kind of person we want to be talking to as we start to plant our seed and build our path to a more customer-centric future. So starting at the top here, I want to dwell on this notion of looking toward the long term, because by now we're several months into the pandemic and the notion of crisis response may seem cliche to some people. The idea of just what do we do to catch up may not be everyone's top of mind topic. They want to start to look to the future. But the reality is we're not there yet in a lot of organizations. We are still figuring things out and overcoming some pressing challenges. And on top of all that, we don't even necessarily know where the industry is going. There's still so much uncertainty. So given that we do have so much to focus on right now, what are some of those urgent priorities you see on your docket?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think every organization, at least many that I've spoken to, are taking a wait and see approach in terms of turning their attention to the longer term, because no one's sure exactly how long and to what degree this thing's going to carry on, right? So it is still very much anchored in the day-to-day. And for a lot of us down in the trenches, it comes down to, really two or three things that are driving your attention. The first is the volumes. Volumes are unpredictably all over the place, right? A lot of organizations are seeing huge growth in their volumes. Some are seeing massive reductions. So you really have to react in a lot more of a nimble day-to-day fashion than you did before, because you're never sure what one day is going to bring compared to the next. And I think that gets amplified when you add the second challenge, which is, a lot of the connectivity issues that we're facing. So it's not so bad with remote agents in the continental US or in Canada, but particularly when it comes to outsourced partners, where a lot of us are trying to manage through remote support structures in places where the internet or the network connectivity is not as reliable. And so as those folks have transitioned to work from home, you've got daily adjustments on who's able to get connected, who's able to support the phones, how do I swap them in and out? And then finally, the forecasting. So a lot of us in the industry, as you know, drive a lot of our resourcing based on forecasting models on what happens on every other Monday or every one of the Mondays for the last 6 or 8 weeks. All of those things got effectively tossed entirely out the window. So the way you're having to adjust your resources among functions, among channels, again, is fluctuating highly on a day-to-day basis. So to your point, with those three things, the reality is we're still trying to make sure we can serve our customers the way we need to on a day in and day out basis, without being able to look yet to that long term.
Yeah, and I think on top of all that, you just have the idea that customers are not going to ease their expectations. They're not going to say, give me a bad experience for 6 months so you can figure out what you want to do for the future. They have urgent needs right now, and that makes the idea of really focusing on the short term still so important.
Yeah, I think that's true. What is interesting is I've found that because in a situation like this global pandemic, at least to me, it's been very similar to the economic downturn we saw in 2008 and even after 9/11, when the significance of the event is also touching many of our customers' lives as well. We're actually finding them to be more empathetic to the service experience that may not be as good as they're used to getting, right? So we actually have seen some of our results go up as we've been facing challenges, because maybe it's better than what they were expecting to receive under the circumstances, and they can relate to the challenge. So that's been a positive, an interesting positive in all this as well.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a fair point. Now, I know what you said all makes sense. That said, we do need to start thinking about the long term. One of the big topics right now has been business continuity. And if we had started to think about what might go wrong or what we might need, frankly, we would have been in a better position to react to what's happened over the past few months. So I do think it's certainly important to start thinking about where we want to go, how the contact center is going to evolve. And for all the reasons you mentioned, it's impossible to totally predict that. But I'd imagine there have been some lessons you've had over the past few months that give you an idea of some things you can say with certain need to be put into place, some predictions, you will, that you're pretty sure are going to come true.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a couple. I think the first one is, and this may sound a little bit cliche for some of the more avant-garde contact center operators out there, but this is really validated, certainly for the more traditional folks who believe cost center operations have to exist on a floor in a building. This entire scenario has validated the fact that we, by and large, are able to work effectively from home with these kinds of resources in these kinds of roles. And I know that was not something that a lot of organizations paid a lot of heed to. So I think one of the things you're definitely going to see is, maybe some relaxation of some of those hard and fast rules that said, nope, contact centers have to operate in a geography, in a building, in a space, because we've shown when forced to, we can do very, very well in a remote environment. So, and that's maybe more unique to financial services in our space, but I think that's the first thing we're going to see is perhaps some more creative approaches to where and how you staff the roles, and a broader acceptance of a work from home workforce, which opens up all sorts of possibilities, from recruiting to to shifts and all that type of thing. So I think that's one. I think the other is, to your point about BCP, you can plan only for so many scenarios, right? So I think the other thing that's going to come in here is the whole idea of fungibility of resources. So being able to concentrate efforts on ensuring that you've got the kind of cross-training and flexibility of the technology and the systems that allow for a higher degree of substitution of folks across your contact center operation for each other, where you have to cover for an entire outsourcing partner, or where whole countries are unavailable, as we're seeing now, right? So we tended to operate BCP on the level of the building, right? Or the network connectivity of a certain space or area. But this has just proven to us that you've got to go bigger than that. And I think what makes it interesting is a lot of our innovation has been driven by cost containment and cost control. And I think what this pandemic has shown us is that there's also a risk reduction value, particularly as it relates to choices that you may want to put in place around the way you train your staff, the multiplicity of systems they use, and all those kinds of things. So I think those two things are really going to rise up to the front, along with, the same pieces we've been seeing for a while around a higher drive to automation and AI.
Yeah, and of those two things, those are generally the most universal responses across industries. Our data shows that you're either transitioning to remote work and leveraging remote collaboration tools, looking at staff differently, or adopting digital channels. Now, I want to just dive a little deeper into the people element, because you hit on a few things there. First and foremost, remote work is foreign to a lot of customer contact organizations, and just the way you engage and maximize performance as people working from home is definitely top of mind. But there's also other things. You mentioned changes in the way we think about outsourcing. There's the notion of, if we have different ways of interacting with our customers, or if we have to shrink our headcounts and reallocate resources, there's going to be some training and some cross-training elements that come into play as well. So as you think about how people within the contact center are changing across some of the examples you mentioned, some of what I just said, what are some of the key considerations you have to make sure that we're putting these people in position to succeed?
Yeah, so what I won't spend a lot of time on is, the subject that I think all of us have seen done to death at this point in the pandemic, which is, how do you ensure you get effective performance out of remote staff, right? Making sure that they stay engaged with a workforce that's distant, or finding ways to make sure they shut down and don't burn out. Lots of material on that. I think one of the most interesting areas that you brought up was around how we rethink outsourcing. So, as you know, it's always been a cost control driven partnership, largely for most of our businesses that are in the space. But they've also always been entirely grounded in working in facilities and buildings, right? So very few of them are effectively equipped to work from home in scale. And we as customers often had very tight restrictions on how we expected them to work, and the sort of controls we put on how they access the building, how they charge their time, all of those sorts of things. This pandemic has proven that a lot of that stuff can be relaxed, right? And still you can get effective service from these outsourcers. So I think it's going to change the way we think about what's truly important when it comes to what we get out of an outsourcing relationship. And I think for the outsourcers itself, for themselves, they are not as familiar in a lot of cases with how to effectively manage remote staff, because that isn't the way they operate. They're used to seeing a lot of people on a floor, and they manage by looking over their shoulder and making sure they can see what everybody's doing or supposed to be doing, right? So I think for them, their transition has to be one of sort of putting those tools in the toolbox of their managers, because I don't think this reality of these kinds of possibilities of having to go back to remote working in scale is going to go away anytime soon. So I think they're going to have to adjust their models as well. So changing what we expect of them, and also having some more flexibility on how they think about BCP in a remote working environment.
So when we talk about changing people, that really uncovers and illustrates the importance of thinking about agent effort. I know it's something that you and I have spoken about quite a bit. I know it was a big priority for your organization, this idea that, well, if we want to make things easier for our customers, oftentimes it starts with making things easier for our agents. And that's going to be doubly true, I'd imagine, when you're talking about suddenly changing their work environment, suddenly working with new partners. If you don't make it easy to get up to speed, it's going to be a real gap in your experience. So I know that maybe agent effort as a score may be taking a backseat right now, but certainly you're thinking about ways to make it easier for agents to adapt, evolve, and contribute from different parts of the world.
Yeah, it's funny, you say that. I think one of the things we've noticed is that some of the more fundamental dimensions of agent effort are rising to the forefront in the scenarios that we're seeing today. So, for example, their ability to connect and work effectively within the application set in a remote environment has taken the place of us in the short term being worried about how many applications they're touching, because I can't fix that right now. But every day I'm really paying close attention to, and I'm having them pay close attention to, how many times they're getting knocked off the networks, how often their ISPs are going down, how long the systems are taking when they lag for them to log in from these remote scenarios or their homes, right? And so what we're finding we're sort of retuning ourselves to is how much productivity is lost as a result of the remote dimension, and how we optimize their ability to minimize that. So in a lot of cases, that may mean shifting them among channels. So if Brian's phone isn't working effectively from his ISP at home one day, being able to get him off that so he isn't in a frustrated, unproductive situation, and switch him over onto, let's say, chat, where maybe he's able to connect and work more effectively. That's how we've been having to think about that in the short term. But yes, I think otherwise effort is still going to be paramount. It's just our vision on it has sort of shrunk to what's right in front of the vehicle rather than what's on the horizon.
But you're still thinking about, it sounds like, the core trifecta, which is, first of all, making it less frustrating for agents to do their
100%.
job. Second of all, making it so that they're more productive. And then, that they're actually not wasting time doing the wrong thing. And
That's
then
right.
Third, focusing on areas that kind of translate directly into customer interactions. If their systems keep dropping out, if their phone quality is bad, not only is that frustrating, not only does it make them slow, but the customers are going to feel that. And so I like 100%. That everything you did there kind of hits all three of those buckets. I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
So I think, Brad, what you did there is you really broke out everything that needs to be top of mind as we see a change in how our contact centers are constructed, what they iteil, and what our agents are going through in their goal of satisfying customers. Now, that's, of course, going to be a huge focus for CCW this summer. We're in our 21st iteration of the event, and you've actually been a frequent speaker, not just at the Vegas event, but many of our conferences throughout the years, and also a steady member of our advisory board. So what keeps you coming back?
Well, I think, first of all, it's such a diversity of participants from an industry perspective, from a functional perspective. CCW does a great job of bringing all the contact center roles and organizations together and offering something for everyone. So I find there's always something new to learn. There is always great cutting edge vendors and technology to sort of stay on top of where things are going. And also, finally, the contact center people, I think, are just a special brand of folks, right? So we've all got that service mindset. So everybody wants to help each other. So it tends to be a very engaging and friendly community that I look forward to spending time with on a regular basis.
Now, one thing that we're doing for the first time ever, and it's probably predictable given the environment right now, is we're incorporating an at-home virtual component into our Big Vegas event. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that looks really interesting. Obviously it's difficult to replicate the in-person experience, right? Particularly in Vegas. But we'll work with what we've got. I think it's going to be very well attended because we all need some interaction. I think, coming back to that prior point, we are all fairly engaging, outgoing people, and many of us have spent an awful lot of time on our own and only connected remotely to those we work with over the last many weeks, right? So I think everyone's going to jump at the chance to participate in an engagement with their peers because no one's been going to any conferences and things either. So I think you're going to have a great turnout. And I think the other thing is there's some really interesting tech that you guys are taking advantage of to try and replicate the whole exhibit hall demo experience. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing it. Really, from what I've seen, I think you could actually be more effective and efficient than you are on a true booth floor at being able to get in and see who you want to see, talk to who you want to talk to, and have a look at the things that are on offer.
And that's definitely it. Yeah, we're doing a lot on the tech side to replicate interaction capabilities, both in terms of breakout rooms and roundtables and chats, as well as the vendor thing you mentioned. Basically, the way I see it, we're bringing a lot of the face-to-face experience to you. We're just freeing you of the going to a blackjack table and losing your money anyway. So if anything, it's going to be a more productive endeavor than Vegas might be if you don't have a chance to join us out there. Now, one other thing I wanted to bring up was the notion of maximizing time. So certainly an event experience is all about, a huge component is the interactions, which you talked about, but a lot of our listeners do have some very specific goals they want to get as far as questions they need answered, technology that they need to demo and really understand. So as someone who has been to many of our events, any advice you have for really maximizing your time so that not only do you feel like you had a great experience, you go back to the office and you can share your results?
Yep. So I think there are 3 or 4 tips that I would share. I think the first one is do a little bit of homework in advance. So to your point about most of us will have some strategic goal or outcome that we're looking to achieve at the conference. Do some homework ahead of time and figure out which sessions are going on in the agenda that are most relevant to your topic. Which vendors in the space are going to be there. Set some appointments up ahead of time, right? So figure out your must-go sessions in advance, mark them in the schedule. The second thing I would offer is check out what other peers and practitioners are attending, right? So who else would you want to talk to? So often what I find happens is you casually bump into somebody that is an extremely valuable contact on the third day, late in the afternoon, and you're like, I wish I'd known you were here, would have spent more time and gotten together earlier. I think you guys do a great job of usually sharing the types of which organizations are going to be in attendance, and you offer the opportunity for participants to begin networking before they get there. So I think take advantage of that and find out who you want to meet before you go. A third piece of advice would be everyone should attend at least 2 sessions on a topic that's unfamiliar to you. So because you guys have such a diversity of industry and activity, I find there's always something new to learn, but if you're too focused on your goals, you may be missing out on some new technology or some new software or some new thinking that may be hitting a different segment. So I always like to also try to pick out at least 1 or 2 things and go to some sessions that are not related to what I came for to sort of broaden my horizons. And then finally, I would say resist the urge to jam up every single hour with a session or a booking before you get there. So much of what happens at these conferences evolves in the day-to-day activity and who you meet and what happens, that, you know, on one hand, we're all trying to make sure we get as much value as possible and go to as many of the sessions as possible, but then you always find yourself jammed for time because you meet someone and you don't have a free window to spend some time with them or do some networking. So I always like to keep my calendar at about 75% to 80% full going into the session, knowing that I've got some slots I can fill with incidental opportunity. So those would be my tips.
Yeah, great tips there. And for those of you who are going to be joining us in Vegas or whether you're going to be connecting via our virtual platform, take advantage of those. Brad's done this many times, and we've seen so much improvement, not only in his organization, some great scores to boast about, but also just his perspective on the market continues to evolve based on his experiencing new topics, interacting with new people. And that's a lot of it we hope is coming from his time at our events. And, you know, you can be Brad too if you take advantage of your time at CCW this summer, as well as continue checking out CCW Digital for great content. So Brad, you know, anything you want to say as we wrap up today's podcast?
No, I really look forward to the CCW at home event if I can't be there in person in Vegas, and I look forward to it. Thanks for the time, Brian.
And by the way, if you're on the fence about Vegas, trust me, everybody wins at blackjack. So ignore what I said about being afraid of losing money. You're going to make so much money. The cost of the trip will be paid for. And for CCW Digital, this has been Brian Cantor. Thank you for joining us.